This lecture covers the CFA Level 1 reading on monopoly. What is a monopoly? In a monopoly, we simply have one seller of a well-defined good. So for example, if you are talking about a large city and in that city there's just one producer of electricity, then the producer of electricity is a monopoly. A monopoly will always face a downward sloping demand curve. What that means is that a monopoly must reduce prices in order to increase quantity sold. So in our typical price quantity demand curve, so the y-axis is the price, the x-axis is quantity. So let's talk about our electricity producer. If the price, let's say per unit, is $15, then the quantity demanded will be very low, and as the price is decreased, the quantity demanded will go up. So this is a downward sloping demand curve faced by the monopoly. By definition, in a monopoly there are no close substitutes. If there were substitutes, then this would not be a monopoly. How are monopolies created? They are, broadly speaking, two ways, but the fundamental idea is that if they need to be very high barriers to entry. The barriers to entry can either be natural in the form of economies of scale, or they can be legal barriers. So let's first look at natural barriers. Natural barrier occurs when the cost curve for a monopoly is constantly sloping downwards. So if you have now let's look at average cost. So if your average cost per unit is always going downwards, so if this is your average cost curve which is constantly moving down, this helps create a natural monopoly. Now let's look at an example over here. So continuing with the electricity producer example, in this case, if the demand for electricity in the city is about 4.5 million units, the average cost for a monopoly is just under $5 per unit. If any small competitor tries to come in and let's say they can produce initially 1 million units or supply 1 million units, their cost would be more than double the cost of the monopoly, which makes it extremely difficult for any new player to enter the market. So that's an example of economies of scale which help create a natural monopoly. The other scenario where monopolies are created are where there are legal barriers, or in a situation where the government has given the license only to one provider. So if you take in a small country, it is possible that the government only allows one airline to provide airline services within the country. So that would be an example. So that airline would then essentially become a monopoly, and it's a monopoly because of a government license only for that business. Now let's look at the relationship between price and marginal revenue in the context of a monopoly. We'll take an example of a taxi cab service from a small airport. Let's say that there is only one taxi cab service which is allowed to provide transportation services from the airport. So effectively it is a monopoly. And let's say that the demand curve is given by the price and quantity data shown here. Y-axis, as always, is the price and x-axis is quantity. So here what we are shown is at a price of 200, the quantity demanded is 0. As we reduce our price, so at a price of 180, the quantity demanded is 1. So quantity demanded, let's say this is 1, and as we keep reducing our price, the quantity goes up. So let's say that at a price of about 100, the quantity demanded is 5. So you have this typical downward sloping demand curve. So at 100, the quantity demanded comes up to 5, and let's say that this demand curve keeps going this way. So that's our demand curve. Now, how do we come up with a marginal revenue curve? In a monopoly, so let's just create the marginal revenue curve, and then I'll explain where it comes from. So what is marginal revenue? Marginal revenue is the additional revenue when you sell one more unit. So going from 0 units to 1 unit, the additional revenue was 180. So in going from 0 to 1, our additional revenue was 180. And then going from 1 unit to 2 units, our additional revenue is 140. So when you go from 1 to 2, our additional revenue is 140, and so on. So here the additional revenue is 140. So you will notice that the marginal revenue curve is steeper than the demand curve, and it's contained within the demand curve. So in a monopoly, this is typically what a marginal revenue curve will look like. So if you had trouble understanding this, just pause and look at the numbers and try to plot the demand curve and marginal revenue curve yourself. Now let's look at the relationship between marginal revenue and elasticity. To an extent, you have seen these pictures earlier in your economics course, but let's just create the demand curve, marginal revenue curve, and the total revenue curve for the example that we've just been talking about. So what was so let's on the left put first the demand curve and then the marginal revenue curve again. So again, this is the price or the cost. Let's first talk about the demand curve again. As we said, when the price was 200, the quantity demanded was 0, and as we reduced the price to 100, the quantity demanded became 5. And let's say that we just can keep going this way, and when the price comes down to 0, then the absolute maximum number of rights provided is 10. So this is our demand curve. Our marginal revenue curve looks like this. So as we've seen this before, so marginal revenue curve at 5, the marginal revenue becomes 0. And let's just understand this. As you've seen in the first chapter on elasticity, when you look at a demand curve, the region at the top left is your elastic region. So in the elastic region, as you decrease price, quantity goes up, but by a higher percent. So a 1% decrease in price will create a higher than 1% increase in quantity. At a certain point, we are unit elastic, which means that a 1% decrease in price creates a 1% increase in quantity, and after that we are inelastic. So notice that when you are unit elastic, if a 1% decrease in price creates a 1% increase in quantity, what's the change in marginal revenue for the additional unit? So if price and quantity are changing in the same with the same percentage, one is going up, the other is going down, the marginal revenue, the additional revenue will be 0. And let's say that happens at 5 units. Now after 5, what's going on? After 5, a 1% decrease in price creates a less than 1% increase in quantity. So the marginal revenue is actually negative after this point. So after this point, the marginal revenue is negative and keeps going further negative as we become more and more inelastic. Now, how does this correlate with the total revenue curve? Remember, the total revenue curve, when your price is very high but quantity demanded is 0, the revenue will be 0. when the price is 5, we are unit elastic, and at that point the revenue will be maximum. And finally, when you decrease your price but decrease your price nearly down to 0, then the revenue also comes practically down to 0. So your total revenue curve sort of looks like this. So starts at 0, ends at 0, and is maximum where your quantity is 5. So on this graph, the x-axis was quantity and the y-axis was total revenue. So that's your marginal revenue and the relationship with total revenue and elasticity. Now let's look at the concept of output and price. We've talked about the quantity at which the revenue is maximized, but what is a monopolist after? A monopolist is actually concerned with the maximum possible profit. So a monopolist tries to determine what quantity to produce so as to maximize profit, and then he will sell for the highest price at that quantity. Let's continue with our example, and to determine the profit maximizing quantity, we will again look at two graphs. So in the first graph we look again quantity on the x-axis, and the y-axis will show both total revenue and total cost. So let's say that our total revenue curve looks something like this. Initially the revenue is 0, and then as we just plotted, the total revenue starts at 0, and at a quantity of 5 the total revenue was maximized. And let's say, so this is our total revenue curve. Let's also plot our total cost curve. So let's say that there is some fixed cost, so the total cost curve starts like this and goes like this. So this is our total cost curve. Now at what point will profit be maximized? Profit is maximized at a point where the difference between total revenue and total cost is maximum. So let's say that this distance, which is essentially your profit, total revenue minus total cost, let's say that this is maximized at 3 units. So this then will be the profit maximizing quantity at which the monopolist will basically sell 3 units. Let's look at it a slightly different way in terms of marginal revenue and marginal cost. For reasons that we have discussed earlier, the profit maximizing quantity will always be the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So let's say that this is our marginal cost curve. So this is marginal cost, and this is our marginal revenue curve. So notice that the marginal revenue and marginal cost must intersect at a quantity of 3, which we have shown above. Now how does the price get determined? The price gets determined by now seeing at a quantity of 3, you then plot this against now you need to look at the demand curve. So let's say that the demand curve looks something like this. So this is your demand curve. So to determine what price the monopolist will sell at, we look at the quantity of 3, and at 3 we take a look at what price we are at. So let's say at a quantity of 3 we are at a price of 140. So basically that is saying that at a quantity of 3, consumers are willing to pay 140. So that is the price that is set by the monopolist. Now what are the profits, or what's the economic profit of the monopolist? That obviously depends on price, and it depends on average cost. So if the average cost of the monopolist looks something like this, so this is, let's say, the average cost curve. So if this is the average cost curve, at a quantity of 3, let's say that the cost is 100. So at a quantity of 3, if the average cost is 100, what's the overall profit for the monopolist? The overall profit is represented by this area over here. So quantity of 3 and the profit per unit is 140 minus 100. So the total profit will be equal to 40 times 3, which is 120. So that then is the profit of the monopolist. Again, key point to remember that with any sort of industry structure, the profit maximizing quantity is when marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. The CFA loves to ask questions comparing different industry structures, and we've already talked about perfect competition. So let's look at the differences between a monopoly and a perfectly competitive business. So monopoly, as you've seen, is a price setter. So they figure out what quantity to sell to maximize their profits, and then based on that quantity they set a given price. With a monopoly, there should be no close substitutes. If there are close substitutes, then the monopoly actually then it will not be a monopoly. So important to know that there are no close substitutes. Demand curve is downward sloping, that we've talked about, and a monopoly can earn profits both in the short run and the long run. As a quick refresher, with a perfectly competitive business, in perfect competition, companies simply take a price, which the price is set by the market. There are many very close substitutes. Demand curve is flat, and if you recall, the demand curve, marginal revenue and marginal price were all the same. A perfectly competitive business might earn profits in the short run, but in the long run, economic profits will always be zero. Let's talk about the concept of efficiency now. We are going to, you've already seen this, but as a quick refresher, the fact is that perfectly competitive businesses are efficient, in the sense that industries where we have perfect competition are efficient. What does efficiency mean? So let's take our price and quantity. So we have, in a perfectly competitive business, if you recall, the supply curve is essentially a marginal social cost, and the demand curve for the industry is your marginal social benefit. The quantity and price that is set in a perfectly competitive market is based on the intersection of the marginal cost and marginal benefit curves. So notice that the consumer surplus plus producer surplus is maximized, there is no dead weight loss, and we are completely efficient. What happens in a monopoly? In a monopoly, let's just again do this very fast, and you need to be able to plot these curves quickly also. So let's say that you have a similar marginal social cost, which is also your supply curve. Let's say that we have this similar looking demand curve, but the monopolist will also have a marginal revenue curve which looks like this, and we've already shown why the marginal revenue curve is steeper. So now what quantity will the monopolist set? The monopolist will set a quantity to maximize his profits, and that quantity is the point where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect. So the quantity set by the monopolist is going to be less than the quantity set in perfect competition. And what about price? So for price, we then take that quantity and read the amount of the demand curve, and notice that the price in a monopoly is going to be higher than the price in perfect competition. Plus, what's the dead weight loss? Notice that in this region, this quantity would have been what is optimum or efficient, and this region that I have shaded black is the deadweight loss. In this region, the marginal benefit to society would have been more than marginal cost. So society would have been better off if we were at this point, but we are not. So what we lose is the deadweight loss. So this is a measure of the inefficiency of a monopoly. Now let's talk about the concept of rent seeking. To understand rent seeking, first you need to understand economic rent. So what is economic rent? Economic rent refers to any surplus. So the consumer surplus, producer surplus, all this together is economic rent. Rent seeking is the pursuit of wealth by capturing economic rent. So you can think of monopolies as being greedy. So monopolies are greedy. What they want to try and do is capture as much of the consumer surplus for themselves. So that process of trying to capture more and more of economic rent or consumer surplus can be thought of as rent seeking. How can an entity engage in rent seeking? It can do so by either to buy a monopoly. So if you are a large player in a given industry, you try to buy all your competitors and essentially create a monopoly. Another procedure might be to try and create a monopoly. So you either reduce prices or try to get licenses from the government and essentially create a monopoly. In both cases, this process of rent seeking will cost money. What will that process do? It will drive up your average total cost curve, and it is quite possible that as you keep driving up your total cost curve, the economic profits eventually go down to zero. Now if you look at this very quickly, let's try to just sketch this. If this is the demand curve, this is, let's say, marginal revenue, and this is marginal cost. The quantity at which profit will be maximized is shown by this quantity Q over here. Now, and what's the price? The price is this price P. What are the profits? Profits are then determined by the average, by the difference between the price at which the monopolist can sell and the average price. So if initially our average cost curve looks like this, so this is our average cost curve, the profit is given by this amount, and you can create the whole rectangle for the total profit. But if rent seeking causes the average cost curve to go up and eventually our average cost curve passes through this point, then what happens to economic profits? Then, as you can see, if the price being charged is equal to the average total cost, then the economic profit is effectively down to zero. Another important concept when we talk about monopolies is the concept of price discrimination. What does price discrimination mean? Price discrimination means selling the same good or service at different prices. With price discrimination, the monopolist takes essentially a share of the consumer surplus, and two prerequisites to be able to do price discrimination. One is that we must be able to identify and separate different buyer types, and we must sell a product that cannot be resold. I'll get to these last two points later. A classic example of price discrimination happens in the airline industry. So let's say that a given airline faces this usual downward sloping demand curve, and let's say that if there was no price discrimination, then we do our usual graphs for a monopoly. So let's say that this is our marginal cost curve. This is, let's say, our marginal revenue passes through. This is our marginal revenue. So we set this quantity and this price P. All right, and depending on where the average cost is going for, that will determine the profits. But let's say that this quantity Q is 10 units, and airline determines that they have two kinds of travelers: leisure travelers and business travelers. And let's say that the airline can actually distinguish and identify who the business travelers are, and it can also determine that the business travelers are willing to pay more. So let's say that this original price P is 1,000, and the airline determines that business travelers are actually willing to pay 1,500. And let's say business travelers are the ones who are who with their travel are doing who are just traveling for for a few days, and they do not have a Saturday night stay over in their travel. So for such travelers, the airline charges 1,500, and effectively the airline then has two prices: 1,500 for business travelers and 1,000 for leisure travelers. With this setup, what has the airline managed to do? Initially, with a price of only one price of 1,000, what was the total consumer surplus? The consumer surplus was this area that I have just shaded. But if the airline can now charge two prices, what has it done? What it has done is it has taken away some of the consumer surplus. So this area now that I am shading, this area is the part of the consumer surplus that gets taken away when the airline can set two different prices. So that's the benefit to the airline for being able to do price discrimination. Obviously consumers lose out, because this area that I've just shaded is the reduction in consumer surplus, and this then becomes the profit for the airline. Alright, so the last point in the context of the slide, monopolies can extract consumer surplus in two ways. One is through units of goods, and the other is groups of buyers. The groups of buyers example is the one that I just gave. So basically the airline separated two groups of buyers. One was the business traveler and the other was the leisure traveler, and the same product was sold at two different prices. With units of goods, the classic example is volume discounts or bulk discounts. The same product is sold, but if a consumer buys a small quantity, he pays a high price. If he buys a large quantity, he pays a low price. So that's an example of price discrimination with units of goods. What is perfect price discrimination? With perfect price discrimination, what a monopoly does is, and this is actually a theoretical limit, very hard for this to happen in the real world. With perfect price discrimination, what a monopolist can do is charge the maximum price. So basically a monopoly can then determine what's the maximum price a consumer is willing to pay for each quantity, and then essentially charge that maximum price. So if the first consumer is willing to pay 100, then the price charged is 100. If the next consumer is willing to pay 90, the price charged to him is 90. So notice that the marginal revenue curve, so the additional revenue for each additional unit sold, is essentially then the same as the demand curve. So marginal revenue becomes the same as the demand curve. And what will happen to our quantity sold? Let's say, what's the profit maximizing quantity? It's the point where marginal revenue intersects marginal cost. So in a sense, if a monopoly can do perfect price discrimination, the quantity sold goes up, because now we don't have a downward sloping marginal revenue curve that is steeper than the demand curve. So the marginal revenue curve, which originally in all our examples so far was something like this, the marginal revenue curve has now actually become the same as the demand curve. So what happens to the quantity? The quantity goes up. So in a sense, we are now at the efficient quantity, but obviously the problem here is that there is absolutely no consumer surplus. By doing perfect price discrimination, what the monopoly has been able to do is to basically capture all the consumer surplus. The quantity produced though is a efficient quantity. How do we regulate a natural monopoly? All you need to know here is two fundamental points: that clearly monopolies are not efficient, quantity is low, price is high. So what do governments try to do? Governments try to regulate monopoly, and broadly speaking there are two ways of regulating a monopoly. One is called average cost pricing and the other is marginal cost pricing. So let's take the simple setup where you have a somewhat flat marginal cost curve and you have a usual downward sloping demand curve, and let's say that there is, we don't have perfect so no price discrimination, and let's say our marginal revenue curve looks like this. What would the profit maximizing quantity and then price be? It would be this Q1 and P1 over here. Now if a government does average cost pricing, what does that mean? With average cost pricing, the government forces the monopoly to sell at a price which is equal to the long run average cost. So let's say that our long run average cost looks like this. So our long run average cost, so if this is our long run average cost, in average cost pricing the government will force the monopoly to sell at this price P2, and obviously notice that the quantity sold also goes up from Q1 to Q2. And if this is your long run average cost and the price also is P2 over here, what's the economic profit? The economic profit is 0. What's a potential issue with this sort of regulation? The only major issue is that with average cost pricing there is no incentive for the monopoly to try and cut costs and become more efficient, because the government is simply saying to them that you sell at your average cost. So if average costs go up, then prices will go up too. So that's average cost pricing. The other type of regulation which is less popular in the world is marginal cost pricing, where the government says that you must set a price equal to marginal cost. But what's the problem with marginal cost pricing? The problem is that there is actually going to be a economic loss. So with marginal cost pricing there will actually be a economic loss, which is clearly not a good thing in the long run. Whereas with average cost pricing, with average cost pricing, actually your economic profit is equal to 0. And as you studied earlier, this is not completely bad, because even economic profits equal to 0 means that the monopolist still at least makes a normal profit. So that's it as far as this reading on monopoly is concerned, and as always you now must go back and practice as many questions as possible to fully understand this material.